Good morning, everyone. Thank you all very much for coming to the conference and for attending this session. My name is Devin Carbato, and I'm a professor of law at UCLA. And given that there were some deep and profound questions raised about race, I thought it might eliminate any racial ambiguity and make clear that I am Black as I stand before you. So my job here is rather limited. It is to introduce Professor Darnell Hunt, who really needs no introduction at all. Professor Hunt is a professor of sociology here at UCLA and director of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies. He has written extensively and compellingly on race and media and representation. His work is both theoretically sophisticated on the one hand and empirically grounded on the other. Moreover, Professor Hunt has taken up a lot of what we might call praxis in his work, intervening in a number of debates about access vis-a-vis race and representation in Hollywood, and access vis-a-vis university admissions. He's written several book chapters and articles. Several of these appears not just in scholarly journals, but in more public arena as well. Is author of a number of books, including Screening the Los Angeles Riots, Race and Seeing and Resistance from Cambridge University Press, and Challenging Blackness, Studies on Television and Race in America from Oxford University Press. In addition to his doctorate in sociology, he also holds an MBA and a degree in journalism. I can't think of a person more well situated to help us take up the question of changing demographics and new paradigms of racialization. So please join me in welcoming Professor Darnell Hunt.
Well, thank you, Devin, for that very generous introduction and biography. I really appreciate that. I'm really excited to be here today because I think that we are grappling in this conference with some very, very compelling and important questions about where we happen to be today and how where we are today connects with where we were in the past. In this conference thus far, we've been treated to two really provocative panels that first explored the historical antecedents of what we're calling superdiversity, and just this morning took a closer look at the amazing demographic and cultural diversity in the US, in California, and Los Angeles, and how that has come to characterize the way we think about this nation and this region. Now, the present panel is concerned with the central question. That is, how much of what we are seeing today in relation to what preceded it seems to point to the emergence of a new paradigm of racialization. Now, in the realm of social studies, of course, a paradigm is a conceptual framework that determines what, in the first place, is understood as a social phenomenon, what counts as evidence, and how the relationship between the perceived social phenomenon and evidence is interpreted. Against the backdrop of what we've conceived as California's and emerging America's superdiversity, this panel is really about considering what might be new, if anything, in how we think about our social environment. Questions that motivate this panel include the following. How should we count race? Do the present categories still hold? Does it make sense, as the US Census Bureau is now considering, to count Latina as a new racial category? In other words, does it still make sense to think of race and ethnicity as conceptually distinct terms? How are Black immigrants, for example, from around the globe refiguring in the US context what is meant by Black? And as California is a microcosm of the world in terms of cultures, peoples, languages, and religions that constitute the state, to what degree is the state importing racial regimes from other parts of the world, and to what extent is it exporting ideas about race into the global arena? So we have a very exciting and intimate panel today that will help us explore these issues. First up, we have Asla Bali, who's an acting professor of law in the UCLA School of Law. Professor Bali's research interests focus on public international law generally, including the intersection of international law and international relations, as well as issues of non-proliferation, human rights, and humanitarian law. Professor Bali's talk today will focus on racialization practices in America post 9/11, and in so doing, weigh in on whether what we've termed superdiversity really constitutes anything new in a conceptual sense. Next up, we have Tae-Koo Lee. Tae-Koo Lee is professor of political science and law and chair of the Travers Department of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. His work looks at attitudes on race, immigration, political participation, and various social movements. Today, he'll share with us some of his survey work that explores heterogeneity among Asian Americans, the nation's fastest growing racial group, as we learned earlier, which may shed some light on questions about the continuing utility of making conceptual distinctions between race and ethnicity. Following Tae-Koo, we have Mushana Goman. Mushana Goman is an assistant professor in the Department of Gender Studies here at UCLA. Her work focuses on the examination of cultural geography in the relation to Native women's writing, theories of race and ethnicity, and gender and feminist studies. Today, she'll pick up on and expand upon an important theme introduced in last night's excellent opening session, namely that America was super diverse before colonization. But does this mean that there is nothing conceptually distinct about the social impact of the demographic shifts we see today? Her talk will help us think through these issues. Next, we have Mark Sawyer. Mark Q. Sawyer is professor of political science at UCLA and director of the UCLA Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics. He is currently chair of UCLA's Interdepartmental Program in Afro-American Studies. Professor Sawyer's research explores the intersection of race and gender throughout the Caribbean, immigration, race and citizenship, and globalization in urban communities. Today, he'll speak on a specific case of the types of dynamics associated with the conditions we've termed superdiversity, that is, shifting relations between Latinos and African Americans. And last but certainly not least, we have Michael Omi. Michael Omi is professor of ethnic studies and associate director of the Haas Institute for Fair and Inclusive Society at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Omi's research interests include racial theory and politics, racial and ethnic classification in the census, Asian Americans and racial stratification, and racist and anti-racist social movements. Today, we're asking him to stitch together many of the threads emerging from our earlier panelists by invoking his classic work with Howard Winant on racial formation, as well as more contemporary articulations of it. We couldn't be in better hands when it comes to taking up this question of whether the changing face of the United States actually portends the emergence of new paradigms of racialization. Okay, so the ground rules. We have a large panel. We only have 90 minutes. So we're going to try to hold each panelist to 10 minutes so that we have time for some discussion and Q&A afterwards. So we'll begin with Asla Bali, all right?
Okay, so that is quite a task, 10 minutes. I'm going to do my best. I want to start by saying that in terms of racialization, my situation, the situation of Arab, South Asian, Muslim Americans in the United States is not as clear as the statement with which Professor Carbato began his introductory remarks. We can't say we are X and be very clear about what exactly it is that we are. And in some ways, in talking about demographic changes, there's a tendency to think of the emergence of Muslim Americans as a community in the United States as if it were part of something new, some new demographic change. And yet, in fact, rather than a changing demographic, it's worth going back to the point from which yesterday's panel began and noting that Muslims have been here roughly from the time that the United States began as a colonial settler project, because Muslims were brought here as slaves as part of that project. And more recently, beginning in the 19th century, have also arrived here in the guise of immigrant communities, brought in under various different rubrics, and often having to perform a particular kind of race because the law required it. So they were first, and this has famously been captured in numbers of studies, racialized as white, community. In other words, there had to be a performance of whiteness before courts in order to be entitled to the category of entrance American. And this was typically restricted to Christians that traveled here from the Muslim parts of the world. So from, for example, the Arab Middle East, you would have Christian minorities travel to the United States and be entitled to whiteness in ways that other members of the Arab communities that traveled to the United States were excluded. And so you had this initial moment of racial formation in the United States in which whiteness characterized those members of the community that were able to gain entrance and left out those members of the community, particularly Muslims traveling from any part of the Middle East and South Asia, as not naturalizable or not potentially American. Against that backdrop, we now have then generations from the early 1920s through to, say, the late 1990s of different waves of Muslim immigrants and African-American Muslims in the United States negotiating racial identity through different pathways. What has happened that is new, if we want to talk about racialization as a new paradigm for the Muslim American community, is something that was activated following September 11th, something that took what is internally clearly a super diverse community in which you have an overwhelming diversity of origin stories for the community that has arrived in the United States, and taken that and turned it into a single homogenous category, or attempted to do so through what I can only describe as old paradigms of racialization. And so I'm going to say a little bit about what those technologies have looked like since September 11th, and then say something more about what the opportunities that superdiversity might nonetheless what kinds of opportunities superdiversity might nonetheless afford to these communities now in California and more generally across the country going forward. So to the extent that I'm saying that Muslim Americans are undergoing old forms of racialization at present connected to the impact of September 11th in the United States, this is true, but there are certainly intersecting forms and categories of racialization that have produced a quite toxic brew of subordination for Muslim Americans that might be exceptional and might be something somewhat new. So I'm just going to go through a couple of categories in what will be about 3 or 4 minutes of my very short presentation to try to address what I mean. For example, the intersection of religion and race is not something new or something that Muslim Americans have introduced. It's something, for example, that's been studied in the production of anti-Semitism in this country and the ways in which the Jewish community was racialized. Yet with Islam, there's a way in which both religion stands in both as a racial marker but also as a kind of ideological marker. It has a potency that goes beyond religion, in which the religion itself has been turned into some form of national security ideological threat, a kind of transposition of the Cold War conception of the enemy into a new enemy that's racialized, marked by religion, and also categorized as an ideological threat. And so Muslim identity has undergone what can be called a national securitization as a form of racialization. This began, in terms of the technologies that are deployed for this end, through a series of immigration dragnets immediately after September 11th, in which the immigration system was used to craft a new preventive detention system, a system through which large numbers of South Asian, Arab, Muslim origin men could be gathered up and held in civil immigration detention for indefinite periods of time without any connection to their immigration status or effort to deport them, but rather to hold them so that the FBI could scrutinize them and hold them using the immigration system as a technical basis for detention, absent all of the criminal procedural protections that would attend had the criminal system been used. In the interim, though, in the decade that has passed since that initial strategy, the criminal system itself has been reformed in a variety of ways, and new technologies have been introduced to our ordinary criminal justice system in the category of counterterrorism. So now the kinds of procedural protections, evidentiary requirements, open hearings and so forth that would have attended to a similar dragnet had it been undertaken through the criminal justice system immediately after September 11th, all of those protections have been reduced, and they've been reduced in ways that disproportionately affect and racialize Muslim Americans, because when they come before the courts for any number of crimes, from ordinary credit card fraud through alleged threats and so-called violent extremism, they find themselves confronted with not just the ordinary criminal counts, but counts that connect them to a potential underlying set of terrorist claims, which not only aggravate the potential crimes that they're being accused of, but also radically alter the circumstances through which they go through the process, and also the detention that they are very likely to face in terms of duration and conditions of detention following those trials. So if the legal construction of race began with what other scholars have termed the burdens of whitewashing for the Muslim American community, we now have a different set of technologies being deployed through the courts to racialize this community, and they've also produced their own counter narratives. So we also have a social construction of race from the inside out within this community, a community that for a long time was marked by its efforts to assimilate, to understand itself as part of a sort of naturalized American identity, have now come to identify themselves beyond the African American Muslim community, including all the immigrant categories of Muslim Americans, with non-white Islam in America today. And that has been one of the interesting and potentially fruitful constructive consequences of the ways in which racialization has homogenized, to some extent at least, the experience of Muslim Americans before the court and before the state in the United States. So some just quick notes about additional techniques of racialization before I turn to then those possibilities. One area beyond the criminal justice system that has marked Muslim Americans, from Arab Americans to African American Muslims to South Asian Muslims in the United States, has been the transformation of Muslim speech, including philanthropic activities and ordinary speech acts, journalism, opinions, blogging, and talks like this one today, into categories of material support. So by expressing identity affiliation across transnational context that the community itself exists in, Muslims are very frequently identified as, through their critiques, for example, of US foreign policy, actually affording support to the United States' enemies, and therefore engaging in material support to terrorism. Muslim dissent has also been marked as itself a form of violent extremism, so expressing strong, critical views of US policies domestically and internationally has been transformed into a marker of criminality. Islam itself becomes an aggravating factor in certain ways before the criminal justice system. So the fact that a defendant is Muslim and is being accused of, for example, considering creating their own separate gated community to stay outside of or off the grid in the United States becomes something that turns that Muslim community into a cell, or into something that is plotting beyond whatever the actual substantive planning was for the community to engage in potential threats to the United States more broadly. The immigration system's transformation has migrated into the criminal justice system. And finally, new categories of detention facilities, specifically something called communication management units, which are detention facilities that go beyond the supermax detention facilities to add communicative black hole on detention, have been developed, and the majority of those detained in these facilities are Muslims in the United States. So following their criminalization for acts that had been previously protected, following the traveling through courts and process that reduces protections available to them, these categories of individuals now find themselves detained under conditions that other Americans are not subjected to. All of this has produced a kind of, if you want, internal solidarity within a super diverse Muslim American community that itself, while it's a product of subordinating policies of the state, has nonetheless produced also the possibility for fruitful, constructive politics going forward. So let me just turn to that. Superdiversity introduces new opportunities for coalition building with other communities within the United States for Muslim Americans that are traveling through, as I say, old models of racialization, but in new and really exacerbated intersecting circumstances, but nonetheless in ways that enable them to identify potential fellow travelers or potential allies in coalition building in order to try to resist some of these strategies of the state, while at the same time it has afforded the possibility, these racialization processes, of much greater coalitional solidarity within the Muslim American community. So whereas I would say pre-9/11, as someone who worked with community organizations in the Muslim American community in the pre-9/11 period, you would have a quite disaggregated community in which, let's say Pakistani community and South Asian Muslims worshipped in this part of a city, and African American Muslims worshipped in that part of a city, and persons of Arab origin or descent would worship in a series of mosques associated with their nation of origin. You now have a great ingathering of Muslim Americans in some of the major metropolitan areas in the United States, and this has also been true in Southern California, where targeting of mosques has produced a kind of solidarity and coalition building, community building around particular central Southern California Islamic Islamic centers. But this is also true in Detroit, it's been true in parts of Texas, it's certainly true in the greater New York area and in the Washington, D.C. area. So diversity within the Muslim community has generated internal coalition possibilities now as that community faces a set of unified technologies in its own racialization. In addition, there have been strong coalitions built across Muslim American communities, the African American community in numbers of these cities, not beyond African American Muslim community, precisely because of the experience of policing and the idea that the police now are marking the Muslim American community in a way that previously Muslim Americans themselves may have been inadequately conscious or inadequately in solidarity with African American communities around these policing techniques. Now they've created a new platform for potential coalition building. And this has had lots of different kinds of manifestations. I tell a story in one instance in which I worked with a set of civil liberties, civil rights organizations in the New York area and tried to put together a meeting with Muslim community leaders in 2002, so a year out from the September 11th attacks. I wasn't able to attend the meeting. It was set up and it was to take place in an Islamic high school in Brooklyn, and I found that the meeting fell through because I wasn't physically there. And the reason was because those who went from the civil liberties and civil rights organizations to that high school felt so unfamiliar with the language with which the high school principal had met them, wearing his galabiya and skull cap, inviting them in, praising them, mashallah, for having come to the meeting, and inshallah that the meeting was going to be productive, that they actually felt that they needed a cultural translator to be there in order for the meeting to be constructive, and they postponed it until I could come to the meeting with them so that I could interpret for them the sort of sensibility, vocabulary, language, politically mobilized, conscious community and coalition with others, I think is a testimony to what Superdiversity affords for a community that's been rendered newly vulnerable in the last decade.
Right. Thank you, Aslan. Now, Teku Lee.
Thank you. I can't resist the temptation to pick up the other side of the coin that Devin Carbado showed all of you and say, I am white, or at least I'll try to be for the next 10 minutes and hope that claiming that identity will make what I have to say sound more erudite. I have to also start with an apology to Dr. Hunt that I think I got some communications lines crossed between the two of us. The talk that you said I was going to speak on sounds fascinating. I would love to hear it. I actually have some thoughts on it, but I had planned a different way to spend the next 10 minutes, so my apologies. So a lot of what I wanted to share is kind of a view from 10,000 feet on the question of superdiversity and its implications for the way that we think about race and racialization. And the best way I can try to do this in the 10 minutes that we have is to actually try to read, so my apologies for that as well. So typically the formulation of kind of thought and an inquiry about how the rubber of superdiversity kind of really hits the road of race in the United States is to ask questions that take these kinds of forms. Are Latinos and Asian Americans more like African Americans, or more like other heavily foreign-born, recently arrived, ethnically defined groups in previous periods of American history? Will the future fault lines of racial division be one of white exceptionalism that differentiates the positionality of whites from that of communities of color? Or will it be one of black exceptionalism that differentiates the singular subjectivity of being African American from everyone else's subjectivity? Is there really such a thing as Asian American and Latino given the dazzling internal diversity within these pan-ethnic categories? How will these emerging multiracial identities confound or confirm our rehearsed answers to these other questions? And on the road that I travel the most, these questions take on varieties like, why aren't Latinos more Democratic and Asian Americans more Republican? What does any of this matter if, as many commentators were all too quick to proclaim after 2008, that the election of Barack Obama trumpets a new era of post-racialism, and so on? Now, 10 minutes is barely enough time to even start on an answer to any of those questions. So what I wanted to do with the time I have is try to make one point and make it as well as I can in the time that I have. And that point is that what you see depends on how you decide to look. And if you look at something that's new and changing through old and unchanged lenses, you're going to see more fog than light. Fundamentally, the frameworks and concepts that we bring to any inquiry and the questions we ask of them have a way of defining the answers that we find. So when something like California's superdiversity is unfolding and transforming everything around us with breathtaking acceleration, I think that as social scientists and as scholars who are not social scientists, we have to start rethinking how we study that change. And to illustrate what I mean by this, I'm just going to give 3 different kinds of ways in which sticking to existing concepts and frameworks can be really debilitating. The first and surely most commonly raised caution is the one that I attribute first to Juan Perea, and many others have made the same point, that it's easy to just carry over what Perea calls the black-white paradigm, which isn't even really a paradigm, but carry that over to think about the new superdiversity. So there's a lot of bandwidth of public discourse and scholarly research that takes up as a starting point the dyadic framework of race built on the history of black-white relations in the United States. And as Perea and many others since have cautioned, asking questions like whether Latinos, Asians, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, indigenous people, Arab Americans, multiracial Americans are more like whites or more like blacks itself threatens to render the specificity of discrimination, opportunity, empowerment within these newer groups more opaque, if not altogether occluded. And when you add to this mix Kimberly Crenshaw's reminder of the multiple intersectionalities that cut across these kinds of group boundaries defined around race and ethnicity, things just get trickier and more nuanced. Then there's a second closely linked framework that I think is also potentially problematic in thinking about California's superdiversity and race, namely what I've called in some of my work the black politics archetype. So the black politics archetype describes the particular historically contingent manifestation of groupness in which a demographically defined group, African Americans, has among its members strong and durable rates of primary identification as African Americans, a strong and durable degree of solidarity and group consciousness as African Americans, a strong and durable commitment to politics as a venue for the pursuit of group interests as African Americans, and a strong and durable record of coordinated collective action from the civil rights movement before then to contemporary instantiations like 95% or 93% voting for Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. And a common pitfall that I see when looking at this kind of robust form of groupness is to look at newer groups, relatively newer groups like Latinos and Asian Americans, and then try to fit their experiences within that kind of archetype. What that means in practice and what I see is that a rich concept, for example, like Michael Dawson's linked fate, often gets stripped down to a single item in a quantitative survey, with the origins of group solidarity in a very textured history of freedom struggle and its deep linkages to the organizing role of social movements completely lost in the analysis. And what's further lost by that kind of assumption is that by conceiving of black politics as an archetype in terms of the black-white binary, there's a tacit view that the way group labels translate into collective action or collective politics for Latinos, Asian Americans, and other groups will be functionally isomorphic to the form and the translation that it has taken historically for African Americans vis-a-vis whites. So what I mean by that is, even if there's such a thing, and a lot of people are struggling with this question, of a collective Latino identity or a collective Latino politics, that may not take the same kind of form and move in the same way and have the same kind of dynamics as we found historically and today for African American politics. And the last point to make here on the black politics archetype, which Kathy Cullen, Melissa Harris, Perry, and many others have reminded us, is that black politics itself as an archetype is not a singular thing, and leaning too hard on the idea that there's such a thing as a singular monolithic black politics obscures all the rich heterogeneity, hybridity, and kind of cross-cutting identities within a single racially defined community. And that kind of internal superdiversity, if you will, is going to be at least as palpable for groups like Latinos and Asian Americans. And a third and final illustration of the point that we need to be critical and reflective of the concepts and frameworks we bring to our analysis is in the concept of race itself and how we measure it. And here I'm going to say just a few things that allude to some of my work that Karthik mentioned earlier. Quantitative social science today, and in particular people who use surveys, is sort of at a very odd paradoxical place. On the one hand, even quantitative social scientists who do work on race acknowledge that race is a social construct that's marked by fluidity, multiplicity, contingency, and so on. Yet when we turn to how we go about doing our thing, which is conducting a survey, we wind up measuring things like race in terms that are very fixed and lack that kind of multiplicity and constructed nature. So typical survey might ask, are you black, white, Asian, Latino, or something else? So until the 2000 census, surveys proceeded to ask people how they self-identify in racial and ethnic terms, as though, first, everybody knows whether and how to self-identify with these given categories, like black, white, Latino, Asian, and other. And second, that everybody would simply choose just one category. The first point, that everyone might be able to know how to self-identify with labels like African American, white, Asian American, Latino, is especially relevant when you think about groups that are largely foreign-born or second generation, such as Asian Americans and Latinos, who come, as the previous panel discussed and as some of the questions from the audience alluded to, from country contexts in which either race is less salient, as it is in the United States, or in which race takes on other kinds of constructions, like blanco, moreno, mestizo, trigueño, Indo, and so on, as it is for many immigrant Latinos. So the point that not everyone might be able to choose just one category is especially acute for Americans with multiple racial lineages and compound family histories. And so just changing the way we ask about race can open up new and unexplored spaces. Moreover, even with the census version to mark one or more racial categories, there's this problem with current measurement approaches, that it fails to account for the fact that identification with race is often uncertain for some people and often graded for others. On gradation, just think for a moment about the fact that two people who may respond to a survey by saying, I am Latino, in survey terms, you would say that person is 1 because they're Latino, and someone else who doesn't say that is 0. And you'd have to treat them in your quantitative analysis as being equivalent. But of course, two people who may identify as Latino may have entirely different kinds of subjectively lived experiences, family histories, and so on. And I've done some empirical work here showing that if you design a survey question that allows people to think of their racial identity in terms that are both multiple and graded, you're going to get a very different picture about what's actually happening in the United States today, and something that I think is much closer to what's actually going on the ground. There are many more examples that I could give about what to watch out for and how we think about questions like whether superdiversity is changing our racial paradigms. I'm going to just close by saying that in the realm that I hang out in, which is studying the politics of that superdiversity, the kind of iron cages that I think we need to break out of are things like this, just focusing only on elections and citizenship, and in that process missing things like the spring 2006 immigrant protest marches, varieties of meaningful civic engagement and transnational activism, and so on. Or 2, focusing just on Democrat and Republican, as though these were the only 2 institutional pathways into political engagement, or even meaningful terms at all to groups that are emergent, marginalized, or otherwise outside of the self-perpetuating, semi-permeable system of partisan politics in the United States. And finally, as a third example, focusing on power, very narrowly conceived in terms of winning or losing on an election, rather than in terms of mobilizing to get an issue on the policy agenda, interrogating the hidden modes of socialized ideological thinking that lie beneath the surface of our consciousness, or as Lani Guinier forces us to consider, shifting how we frame power as being something about power over conquest, power over something, to a reframing of power to do something, power from a zero-sum agonistic mode to power as a dynamic, generative, empowering force. I'll just close with a quote that I think well describes both the point that I'm trying to make about scholarship on superdiversity and also how we would engage our own personal politics in a moment of superdiversity. And that quote is from the Dalai Lama, and he says, "Learn the rules so you know how to break them properly."
Thank you, Teku, and I think you actually managed to deliver in 10 minutes a talk that was closer to the spirit of this panel than the one I thought we talked about. Anyway. Okay, next up, Mashana Goldman.
Hi, whoops, sorry, grab this. Sorry, it's a little awkward, but I'm giving you guys some space back there, so you can breathe for a second. It's tight. So my brief talk today will take a multi-pronged approach. What you know, it limits our discussion and rather is intended to open up discussions and considerations so that we might work towards social justice. If superdiversity is a word constructed to form social cohesion, as a Tonawanda Seneca woman, I must account for the impact it will have on Native nations. It is my responsibility, and I speak from that place, and my words here are meant with the intent of decolonial work. First, I just wanted to thank the people whose land we are on, the Tomva. I know it probably was done last night, but I just wanted to do that again today. And I thank the Tomva and Gabrielino people, not just as a side note of recognition, but because I really think the path towards decolonization starts by recognizing everywhere you go whose land you're on and how that land came to be part and incorporated into the United States. And so towards the end, I'll have ways to work towards that decolonial path. I have some suggestions, but that's one of my first suggestions, is always knowing where you are, because otherwise you don't know where you're going. So first, I will consider superdiversity as a keyword or paradigm, as was pointed out, in the vein of Raymond Williams, in that I propose superdiversity as a keyword in which, quote, there is then both controversy and complexity in the term. Secondly, I will interrogate the premises involved in making or establishing it as a keyword and reconsider its genealogies from a Native feminist perspective. Of course, 10 minutes that I have will only provide room in which to, quote, open the door. Primarily, I'm concerned with what is elided, what intersections in the vein of Kimberly Crenshaw's important work that's already been evoked here occurs to create injustice or put in place or constructed through the use of superdiversity, and that is thinking of superdiversity as diversity subjects, or even as an analytic. What does it lose? So following Raymond Williams' practice of developing accounts of words as reflective essays based on the Oxford English Dictionary, I want to take the OED as a point of departure. That is keyword or keyword, in one word, as a combination that both appear under the head word key. A word serving as a key to a cipher or the like, the key word of these inspections. Or B, a word or thing that is of great importance or significance in information retrieval systems. Any informative word in the title or text of a document, chosen as indicating the main content of that document. So my understanding here is that superdiversity was first used in European countries in relation to migration of ex-colonials to London, and to deal with the fear, politicals, and economies that those migrations entailed. So in the context to the United States, I ask, how does settler colonialism determine that understanding of the migration that we see as having, quote, of great importance? That is, if we use Patrick Wolf's assertion that settler colonialism is not an event, but rather a structure, right? A structure that relies on the logics of elimination of the native that occurs through language, eradication, absence of history, erosion of sovereignty rights, colonial nostalgia. The list goes on and on. I am asking us to seriously consider how superdiversity as a term fits into the nuanced power structure of colonialism in California, the United States, and Canada. What knowledge production does it produce as a discourse, both legally and socially? So let me further unpack the way we can assess the term in relation to ongoing settler power in the United States. Important to remember here is that when I use the term settler, I'm employing Scott Morganson's definition of settler as a location, not necessarily a settler as an identity, right? So that is, settler is a location in relation to indigeneity, right? And as such, how can we account for this in relation to superdiversity and migrations in the United States, current and otherwise? In previous work, I've thought about this in relation to Joy Harjo's poetry, right? We also have to recognize imperialism and how it's displaced other indigenous people in countries such as Guatemala, Oaxacan territory, right? The indigenous migrations of these people are part and parcel of similar processes Native people in North America went through years ago. And those are forming new relationships amongst each other as well. So Scott Morganson calls for an ethical alliance of Native people and his account of settler logics and the way that settler is a location. And I appreciate deeply the allied work and methods he moves us to look toward and want us all to consider this as we look toward social justice paradigms. Oh, I think I drank too much coffee today, I'm all jittery. So I have here a quote by Spivak. So when I'm deconstructing the term, I'm not doing so just to the process of deconstructing it, but rather thinking deconstruction does not say there is no subject, there is no truth, there is no history. It simply questions the privileging of identity so that someone is believed to have the truth. It is not the exposure of era, it is constantly and persistently looking into how truths are produced. So what are the truths produced here? I'm getting, ooh. Here I want to talk about the spatialization and temporalization of Native people. First, Native people are always elsewhere. They're on the reservations. They're often up in Minnesota somewhere, maybe the Plains, Arizona. They're always vacated from those places and seen as outside the US. Or they're vacated from urban places, blending into the social imaginary or the invisibility of those politics. They're never proper consumers or part of our current systems. We can think of the problem with the way that Native people are portrayed in Southern California, particularly as consumers, right? Or as degenerate subjects in relation to that. Yet Native people are always remembered through colonial nostalgia by place names, consumer names, such as Jeep Cherokee, and tell tales of the past and narratives of development. Just recently, in that show Molly and Mike, this happened 2 days ago, that Indians are recognized, but always as Indians and drunk dying subjects, right? So how has this attempted erasure of diversity of our languages, origins, laws, and stories and alliances come into these kind of colonial nostalgics that were only remembered in street signs, and what I just named? This is just the diversity that California alone had for languages and political systems and cultural systems. And Dwayne Champagne went over this in the previous section, so I'm going to skip that part, which will save me some time. So what I think of when I think of superdiversity is it not just as a racial category, but what the epistemologies and ontologies of our differences can produce and work to create those social justice systems. So in my version of true superdiversity, this is a picture of Indian country and the way it spans itself across. Now I define Indian country differently than the legal system does. I say everywhere you go is Indian country. So there's Sacred Springs right down the road at my daughter's high school, and those are important to recognize. So what is forgotten in this moment? Of utmost importance it is to recognize the 160 California Indian nations today. That's one way that I think we can work towards not equality, but justice. And part of what I want to work with is thinking about equality versus justice. Because in something like the word superdiversity, what we lose always as Native people is in the numbers game, right? And that is also part and parcel of how the US constructs us, is always disappearing, a small subject, our politics don't matter, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I just want to remind everybody in this room that 15% of American resources are located on Native lands. We do matter. We matter globally. Our uranium mines have been used for nuclear bombs. Our lands have been torn up. Just recently, my daughter went on a survey up at Old Coyote. The land was leased to Blackwell. They created an Iraqi village and blew it all up, that land. There's a grave site there. So I just want to remind, Native people are important, regardless of the number, and I'm worried about superdiversity and losing that within this context. Oh, sorry. Hold on. So I'll keep going here. This particularly comes up because, for me, when we're thinking of just Native people as these symbols and such, and in some degrees, oh, that went for it. Okay, when we think of Native people just as these symbols and such at these degrees, we don't think of Native people as rational thinking Indian people or as Indian nations. This just recently came up with VAWA in the way that we were dismissed as, well, it only excludes small population of people, right? And how can Indians try non-native subjects? And non-native is key there, right? That it's not just not being able to try white people, but not being able to try any non-native on their reservation that has committed rape, kidnapping, murder, etc., pedophilia, etc. Us not being seen as rational people becomes into play. So, as we are often erased in these logics of elimination, blood degrees and measurements become part of the way that our diversity is looked at, right? So there's a way that not even blood degrees have worked, blood quantum and other patrilineal, matrilineal restrictions on membership roles have really worked to eradicate Native people. So while we're celebrating super diversity and the diversity of cultures, etc., Native people are constantly undergoing the pressure of erasure of our membership systems through the federal courts and federal Indian law, but also through laws that have been imposed by trying to maintain a specific system of analysis. So that's a quote by Joanne Barker here. But all of this is to say that in thinking about this diversity, right, that there's not even the other category that we are thinking about is always, always consistently there for us. We've seen many of the slides actually, and this isn't to pull anybody out, I know this is more a matter of disciplinarity, but Native people are always part of that other, right? And if it's always part of that other in statistics, quantitatively, qualitatively, what does that do as a tool, using superdiversity as a tool of settler colonialism, and watch that place, that base, and that ongoing colonialism that Native people face every day? What does it mean? We have the simultaneous romanticization, criminalization, and erasure of Native people as vanishing subjects. Oh, it went away. So, which is kind of ironic. So I wanted to end with Stormy Ogden's word, where she talks about, even in the prison system, and the way that this erasure of Native lands and dispossession of lands, and also dispossessions of the rights to our own bodies and our rights to our own label that has resulted from colonialism. She talks about this, and she talks about, well, I don't have my poem up there now, but she talks about half-breed and how that actually, the way that Native people have been racialized is about dismantling, not creating diverse Indian subjects or recognizing them, which is a problem. So as we move forward, I want to suggest a couple things. First, to acknowledge the people whose place we are on and include them in our discussions. And by that, when I say include them, I first felt that when I was asked to be on this panel, I assumed that another California Native person would be on this panel. I'm not from here, but I think in each and every conference on diversity, superdiversity, race, ethnicity, etc., colonization, decolonization, any of those panels, recognize the people whose land you're on and include them within those conferences. That's my first gesture. Second, watch our charts and statistics by not consistently leaving out Native peoples and putting them under that rubric of other. This may be hard, because I do realize and recognize it's a disciplinary thing as well. And also, always work toward an ethical agenda that recognizes Indigenous rights as not just racialized and gendered subjects, but also rights that fight against colonial amnesia and recognize sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mashana. Now we have Mark Sawyer.
It's perhaps clear that the ancestors are messing with us through these electronic gadgets. It's always interesting. I guess I can say I'm black. You know, the stay black and die thing kind of still stays with me. You know, one of the things there are these odd moments in your own scholarship or your own life as a scholar where you come to some realization that all you're really doing is trying to work out what your advisor taught you. And Teku just made me have one of those extraordinarily awkward moments because we're not just political scientists, but we're political scientists that are I guess different vintages of a similar wine, with him being the more seasoned one in more ways than not. So, and in fact, this also connects, what I'm going to talk about connects to the work, some of the work we've actually done together subsequent to our hijinks at University of Chicago. And if my iPad doesn't keep turning off, see, that's what happens. Okay, so one of the things that's really interesting, and I'll actually one of the ways I'll do it is I'll ground my discussion of superdiversity within the context of some of that discussion that has gone on at UCLA over a while, including during particular periods of the developments of these centers in the IAC. At one point in time, UCLA was the center of a particular kind of study of race and racialization. That is the study of white racial attitudes largely towards black. That work pioneered here by David Sears, Jim Sidanius, and Larry Bobo, involved a particular paradigm of understanding the relationship between the logics of white supremacy as they had their expression in institutional expressions based on the history of slavery and segregation, and its representation within the realm of the social psychological, as measured through public opinion surveys and experiments. That work has a particular way, and in fact, Bobo expanded that work to include, interesting enough, thinking about Native American fishing rights, and developed a series of ideas and paradigms that came to be used to understand the relationship between the structures of dominance that are developed by dominant groups and the attitudes that underlie the developments of those structures that perpetuate different kinds of inequalities. And that largely rested on the history of colonization, slavery, Jim Crow, the conquest of the West, Native American removal, and a range of other things, but largely still focused on, in particular, the specific ways in which white supremacy moved upon black bodies, or the image of blacks in the white mind. It's harder then to transition and really begin to think about the ways in which we're going to have to start to think about intergroup relations that are going to be unearthed, well, in some ways in the shadow of that history, but involving very specific and other kinds of groups. Here I turn to thinking about some of the work that I've done on the relationships between African Americans and Latinos and their attitudes with one another. So one extraordinarily tempting way to go about this, in the same way that the tempting way to think about sort of Asian American or Native American or Latino politics using the kind of black politics paradigm. The other tempting thing to do is to think about the relationships between these groups as largely mapping on to the similar ways in which we might think of the intergroup relations or interactions between whites and African Americans. That is, where you can measure a certain specific set of attitudes, and we can assume that set of attitudes, particularly if they're related to stereotyping or a series of other measures, will relate to a sort of negative view, and in particular negative policy attitudes, negative policy perceptions about the group. So if African Americans stereotype Latinos as perhaps criminal or welfare dependent, does that mean that they will then oppose immigration reform? If African Americans believe that Latinos gaining some measure of political strength will reduce their own, does that mean that African Americans buy into realistic group conflict or a kind of zero-sum game? And the same vice versa, right? Will Latino stereotyping of African Americans reduce their support for affirmative action or a range of other different policy alternatives? So far, the answer has been no. And for those of us who have worked on racial attitudes and trying to adapt these measures to other countries, other contexts, other places, this doesn't necessarily surprise. That is, by doing that work, you come to a broader realization that what we measure is more specifically related to the nature of political social institutions and the particular histories of the development of white supremacy as we understand it in the US. Now, particularly looking at Latino immigrants, we can assume that there is also a logic of racialization and white supremacy that operates in Latin America, but that is one that is disconnected and operates parallel to the sets of institution ideas and racializations that have occurred in the United States. That is, the Mexican ideas, Mexican and or Central American ideas about race and racial hierarchies do not necessarily translate well or very easily to understand and make intelligible US policy decisions, institutions, et cetera. I cannot, and often there's a shorthand to really explain this. If you give me a white American person I can ask them just a few questions and I can tell you a lot about what they think. And in particular, I can ask them just a few questions about race. And the overwhelming logic of the ways in which white supremacy organizes the relationship between the way they see politics, institutions, the way they understand what's fair, what's not fair, the way they weigh the different valuation of human beings in the society, et cetera, the way they see the criminal justice system, a whole range of things, all lines up in a neat row as a result of the power and the deepness of white supremacy and its logic and both our sort of institutions and our psychological lives in the context of the US. With Latinos, this does not work. Latinos and African Americans can in free terms stereotype one another with dramatic skill and availability, but it doesn't necessarily imply that they're any less willing to work with one another, or that it implies that, say for instance, any individual African American will feel any less positively or human towards, say for instance, a policy like comprehensive immigration reform. That is, the politics and ideologies of subordinate groups, having not had their prejudices validated by the sets of institutions in the society and bent to the will of those prejudices, it means that those attitudes are much more free-floating than they are deep structures that exist attached to the ways in which institutions work and construct individuals. That being said, we need to be attentive to these things, but again, I think this is following on from Dr. Lee's comments. We need to really think about and develop new lenses to understand the sets of relationships, rather than attempting to adapt a series of research paradigms developed, many of which were developed at UCLA in the late 80s and early 90s, to a new set of questions and a new superdiversity. The same applies with the relationship between Asian Americans or Native Americans and indigenous peoples. So we have to begin to think about, the call is to begin to develop new lenses, new theories, new ways of thinking about it, but also to understand. It's interesting that you get the two political scientists up here demanding historical specificity. But of course, right, in the ways in which we understand those, and also the ways in which we understand that perhaps the uniqueness of the African American experience is developed out of a series of historical processes as well as ideological debates within the African American community. We might find similar ideological debates across other communities, but those will have a different valence in a particular set of historical ways in which they will experience themselves. So I guess this is a call for what we don't know. Or we do know that the basic paradigms that have been used to study white supremacy and the ways in which it has constructed the others is not an appropriate lens to try and analyze the new superdiversity, or in particular the ways in which groups that are on the margins are interacting with one another. Thank you.
And here these references were to Tiger Woods, Eminem, or Marshall Mathers, and Yao Ming. Now, this joke in some ways, however outdated, does illustrate my main point, that in the midst of superdiversity, we are now experiencing the continuing, if not deepening, instability of race, and instability with regard to concepts of race, racial meanings, and racial stratification. So let me try to advance 3 points about this instability. And the first sort of goes to sort of channeling and extending some of the things that Professor Laura Gomez remarks about the political implications of particular social constructions of race. And part of this, I think, is the best illustration are the ongoing challenges to state-based forms of racial classification, particularly in the census. And what you have in the census, for example, is a persistent kind of gap between state-based categories and individual and collective identities. You may know this, maybe not, that since 1980, in every census, that well over 40% of Latinos actually don't check off a ethnicity, Hispanic, quote-unquote, Hispanic ethnicity box, and a race box in terms of two different questions. But answer this in terms of a checkoff called Sum of the Race. And it's argued that about 90% of those who have checked off Sum of the Race are actually a Latino or some Latino subgroup. You might be also curious to note, as a side, that the census folks tell me that the second most popular designation under Sum of the Race is Jedi. There is an amazing amount of diversity in the Star Wars universe. So what we have here is, as Teku Lee talked about too, is the importance of figuring out how we ask questions about race, but not only that too, how different kinds of political claims for recognition are negotiated. For example, in Census 2010, Iranians actually had a write-in campaign to not check off that they were white, but to check off some of the race and write in Iranian. And we have the emergence of new racialized groups, as Professor Bali has talked about. I love these kinds of acronyms, including one called AMEMSA, which stands for Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian. And in many respects, as Professor Bali noted, that these new forms of racialization often rely on old paradigms of race, particularly conflation here of ethnicities, of religion, and of racial categories. But they also speak to, in some ways, not only claims for recognition and the imposition sometimes of racialization from above, but also lead to forms of political solidarity, perhaps, or coalition building, as she talked about, as a function of this. There's always this tendency, however, in these categories is to be careful what you wish for. And at particular moments in times, groups might want to make claims for recognition. At other points in time, there could be a fear that those same categories, for example, could be used to profile different groups with respect to different kinds of institutional surveillance. The census, and we may be able to have some time to talk somewhat about this, is been engaged in what's called the alternative questionnaire experiment. And many of you know that in 2020 rather, there may be a new format in which it's the dissolution of the Hispanic origin, Hispanic ethnicity question in favor of just one race question in which the category Latino-Hispanic appears. And there are no sort of really targeted specific kinds of ethnic checkoffs. There will be these broad categories which people will check off, and then they would self-identify themselves by some sort of subgroup designation, which allows, for example, whites or blacks for the first time to be able to specify what they are or think they are. There's also something else going on, however, that I think we need to pay attention towards, and that racial instability is also apparent in what is a kind of new rebiologization of race. And the mantra that we share a lot in most of these circles, that race is a social and not a biological concept, is really being challenged in the wake of the Human Genome Project. And there are ominous signs that scholars have been detailing that we are witnessing a reinscription of race as biology. Examples abound in this. In the field of forensics, for those of you who are big fans of the numerous CSI television spin-offs, we have molecular biologist Tony Frodakis of DNA Print Genomics, who came to fame in a Baton Rouge serial murder case in 2003, claiming that he could really determine the race of a murder suspect by analyzing their DNA. In emergent fields like pharmacogenomics, we have seen the introduction of Bidil, the first ethnic designer drug, being marketed by Nitromed to African Americans who suffer from congestive heart failure. And what's interesting in this whole literature is that specific concept of race are being deployed to understand, in this instance, in the field of biomedical research, patients' susceptibility to certain diseases and their receptivity to certain forms of drug treatment. This kind of rebiologization of race takes place in other realms as well. We're all familiar with how Oprah Winfrey and Henry Louis Gates Jr., among others, Skip Gates, have helped to inspire a growing kind of popular quest by individuals to find their racial roots through ostensibly scientific means. my writing partner, Howie Wynant, just sent me a recent article from the New York Times about my roots. Apparently, researchers have identified a mutation in the human gene as a source of distinctive traits, defined as, quote, thicker hair shafts, more sweat glands, characteristically identified teeth, and smaller breasts, unquote, that researchers claim make East Asians different from other races. Now, lest I be misunderstood on this matter, I'm not suggesting that there is no human variation, that human variation does not exist, and that we can find certain kinds of things through population statistics, through different kind of forms of continentally based ancestry or locally based ancestry. But what I'm questioning here is that many of the differences that are being discerned and talked about are quickly understood, conceptualized, and expressed in racial terms. And this very much we do need to pay attention to. Not only the social, scientific kinds of categories, but the ways in which race is being reinscribed as a kind of legitimate genetic and racial category. Let me make my third point so I can get under the wire here. A looming question, I think, is how different racialized groups are going to be really positioned in future racial hierarchies. And of course, who is going to be doing the positioning. And different scenarios have been advanced by different social theorists. George Yancey, for example, talks about an emerging black, non-black divide, with Asian Americans and Latinos being drawn into the white side of the color line, or Eduardo Benilla Silva's triracial order of whites, honorary whites, and what he calls collective black. And Teiko alluded to this as well. You know, just the ways in which there could be different ways, different understandings we have about how racialization in the midst of superdiversity is unfolding, and how group position is going to be contested, challenged, or imposed for certain groups. I should say this as a qualification, that much of this discussion is really kind of US-centric, and that many of these kinds of racial positionings are really part of a deeper global phenomena and global context, and that it is certainly shaped by how race has traveled across national borders and the ways in which racial meanings are really created in a much more global circuit through migration, through the imposition of different forms of racialization. One thing I do want to make clear is that I believe that the emergence of the so-called majority-minority society does not necessarily imply the diminishment of white supremacist ideology, nor does it imply a fundamental restructuring of white racial dominance. In this ways, I'm trying to argue that demography is not destiny. And in many respects, despite the prevailing ideology of colorblindness or calls for us to get beyond race, and the belief that perhaps we're a post-racial society, that within this, despite these claims, that race still very much matters. But the question is not simply does race matter, but how it matters. And I think that's going to be that's where we need to sort of focus our conversation today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Okay, I'm told that we're actually going to run over by about 5 minutes. We have a little play here, so we're going to go till about 12:20. So we have about 15 minutes or so to follow up on some of the emerging themes from our panel here. So who'd like to go first with the question?
Not all at once.
Well, let me, I'll just get the ball rolling here as moderator. One of the issues that I think that's implicit in a lot of what you're talking about up here in the panel is this whole question of, and I think, Michael, you kind of wrapped up with this, was sort of given what we're calling superdiversity and the changing dynamics between different groups and the way that affects people's identity, the way they understand themselves, versus maybe the way they're being represented in society. How people are going to be, I guess, assigned to different locations and whatever the new emerging racial order is. And I guess what I want to hear is some reflection on what role the state or the racial state in your earlier work may play in this process, and how that role is related to the whole topic of inequality, which came up in yesterday's conversation, looking at the relationship between diversity and inequality, and how the state kind of intervenes in that process. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
I can probably speak all day about how the state intervenes in Native politics. It's because it's so consistent, because the state is demands, in some ways, Native people do have the goal, sorry, I stood back a little bit, so we weren't coming here, that the state, the tribal nations have their ability to decide how their membership roles are going to be constructed. But that was done under deep supervision by the state, right? So in order to claim that identity, there's also a way that Native people, if they don't maintain a consistency in those membership roles, then the state can intervene and terminate people. So every time I tell my students this, they're like, what do you mean? They can just say you're not Indian all of a sudden? I was like, yes, the state can just terminate you like they did in the 1950s. There's plenty of looks at this. So I see that as being a huge imposition, and also the ways that, you know, you may be Apache and Navajo, but you can only be recognized in one tribal nation. A lot of people have a restriction on that. So then you have to forego, by the US government, you have to forego membership in another nation. So you have to pick, right? So I see the state constantly making people pick amongst these identities, but this is not a new issue, I think, in terms of the way superdiversity works,
Right.
but it's an old mechanism of settler colonialism and maintains the nation state. So I see actually the racialization as a process of colonization.
Okay.
You know, some thoughts this is derived from some things that Howie Weiner and myself have been thinking about the U.S. racial state in particular, is the contradictions that, on the one hand, of sort of promoting kind of colorblind ideology in which, you know, sort of any sort of policy, law, practice which explicitly recognize race is being disavowed. At the same time, the state, as we talked about it, needing race to rule. And in that, to think about the ways in which mass incarceration, a neoliberal agenda regarding the dismantling of the social welfare net, all these things involve very much a deeply racialized process. And so the state itself, it seems, is a kind of preeminent site of those kinds of contradictions we're going to experience and really be accelerating. In other words, having to sort of impose certain kinds of racial regimes, at the same time trying to make, at least at one level, a kind of formal disavowal of them.
Mm-hmm. So would it be fair to say that superdiversity maybe complicates the work of the racial state in terms of the types of regimes they have to implement to maintain order?
Yeah, well, yes, no, absolutely. And in that, too, it'll be interesting to see how certain racial subjects get evoked as, you know, for example, think about the model minority image of Asians. I mean, certainly that's persisted since the 50s, actually, more than the mid-60s. But even locating that, thinking about them as neoliberal subjects, of being, you know, sort of not demanding of state institutions, being sort of hardworking, being vested in a kind of individual kind of, you know, fierce competitors in a kind of free market scenario. These are the kinds of things that I think that these kinds of representations sort of get grafted on, in many respects, to these kinds of positions and groups.
Great. Questions in the audience? Okay, right here.
Hi, my name is Miki Fushimoto, and I'm not from academia. I'm someone who's worked in the community for many years, both in the Latino and Asian American community. And I'm not steeped in the literature. I'm familiar with it, but I'm not really deep with it. And so my question to the panelists is, as I listened to the last panel and this panel, is it seems like there's, we're looking at this superdiversity, for lack of a better word, in relationship to white supremacy, as opposed to the intricacies between groups within the racial hierarchy. And one of the last panelists had talked about this is the era of the anti-Mexican or anti-Latino period versus another historical time period which was much more anti-Asian. But my question is, to what extent are academics looking at the fact that one is contingent upon the other, its existence? I think the extent to which there can be anti-immigrant fervor is related to the fact that Asian Americans aren't understood, that, you know, Asian Americans aren't on this, there's a relationship between the two in terms of its definition. And then at a more policy or community level, then the question becomes us understanding that and making that clear in terms of how we work with each other. I'm being a little abstract, but perhaps you understand what I'm saying. Is there any literature on that, or people talking in that vein?
Anyone have any thoughts here?
Can I,
Sure,
I had some thoughts on your original question that I maybe might connect to this. So one thing that's interesting, and Professor Omi ended his comments on this, or on his second point with this, saying, look, categorization is an interesting strategy that communities deploy, and then there may be unintended consequences, or they may find themselves becoming the victims of ways in which those categories then are deployed to police and surveil them. So I think the experience of the Muslim American community at the moment is the sort of the inverse of that, which is surveillance and mapping projects have been explicitly adopted by the state in very public ways that literally map communities that are otherwise erased. So that the census and other forms of categorization choose not to mark these communities, and then the police go out of their way to figure out sort of demographic and other markers and access points like community Islamic centers and so forth in order to map the community strictly for law enforcement purposes. So the idea that the community then has of how it might own these categories or demand a category through these write-in campaigns of Iranian Americans and others is that there's something empowering about owning a racial category as you position yourself to organize in coalitions against the state. And that brings me to this interstitial idea, because you wouldn't think that, right? If all you thought race was doing as work is subordination and nothing else, as you wouldn't embrace that category because you wouldn't imagine it to be a source of empowerment either. Part of what makes it the possibility of empowerment is the recognition of the kind of point you're making, which is that there have been generational and other work, there has been this work done to begin with to mark race in a particular way as an organizing category for politics and to identify interests and also to build coalitions, and that inclusion in that dynamic has empowering potential. So that if you can see why an anti-American moment ends with the beginning of an anti-immigrant, anti-Latino moment, you can also understand why there might be coalitions that could be built between those two communities, and the ways in which they were positioned in those different moments might work to deploy a new political strategy. So I do think these communities are, I don't know what your community organizing work has led you to find, but I do think that there's a consciousness about these historical patterns, and there's a reason why, for example, at this moment, the Muslim American community wishes to embrace categories that previously it had actively rejected, and self-consciously had decided not to identify themselves as a single group because of the levels of diversity that made them simply not identified. Race wasn't salient as their identity category, and they didn't necessarily see the importance of connections between, say, South Asian Muslim and South Asian, Middle Eastern, and African American Muslims in the United States in a way that today it's been made salient for reasons that they may not control, but reasons that they now want to harness control of and build coalition with other communities.
Let me just add that there's a real absence, it seems, of a lot of literature about relations between communities of color. And I was trying to sketch out a graduate seminar I'm teaching now is on comparative racialization, and to look at how much of these kinds of literatures deal with a group of color in relationship to whites. So we have Latinos and whites, so the amount of literature is very little. And I think what's important, sort of going forward, is to be aware of a couple of things. One is not simply making any sort of kind of nostalgic or romantic kinds of notions of solidarity among groups of color, because they've all encountered the same kind of historical forms, or very different but similar forms of discriminatory treatment on the one hand, but also to understand how groups of color have really profoundly shaped the conditions for each other's existence too. in neighborhoods and in cities, et cetera, with respect to not only residential patterns, distribution of resources, et cetera. And I think that's very important for us to observe. And Mark and Teku and others have talked too about the kind of zero-sum logic that's often employed in that one community of color's gain is another community of color's loss. And so there's a number of kinds of interesting kinds of dilemmas in trying to grapple with that. But I think what that means is the necessity to have more and deeper kinds of scholarship.
That prefigures a particular kind of racial politics that is siloed around those racial categories, or that precludes the possibility of, other kinds of racial formations, but for the work of organizing and building movements together. If you think about the census Mark 1 or more category, I think according to the census that creates, in terms of mathematical combinatorics, 63 unique races, and if you combine identities, 249 different identities, but there isn't 63 or 249 different kinds of siloed identity politics around that. A lot of that really kind of depends on what happens on the ground. And the other thing to say is, you mentioned the sort of using the racialized state, the white racialized state, as sort of the mirror on which to look at what's going on. And I think one reason for that is nothing, at least in a lot of the social science research that I do and encounter, does the work of bringing a group together and mobilizing a group together as powerfully as a sense of being othered and a sense of being perceived as, a threat. So, a sense of Latino political identity was constructed out of the ashes of Proposition 187. And today, if you look at, Sensenbrenner says, I'm going to do this, and then you've got thousands of people on the streets. Today the GOP party says that, we don't think we like, immigrants, we don't think we like racial minorities. We've got, some of our political leaders saying things that are just absolutely odious about women, and we've got people in our party who think that this country is in its founding a Christian country. I mean, you're going to turn off a lot of people and you're going to get them activated to the sense of what politics is, why it's relevant, and why you might want to sort of build a kind of, coalitions in the interstices that you're talking about.
Okay. All right, we're going to do one more question. Robin, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, but since time is up, I'll say it in my talk.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for coming out for this panel. I want to thank our wonderful panelists. I mean, admittedly, 10 minutes is not nearly enough time to do their work justice, but hopefully these conversations will continue. We're going to lunch and we can, hit them up then. Thank you.
Lunch is out on the patio. You can eat there.